Monarchs is one of those decks that is absolutely broken, but it hasn't really gotten a fair chance to prove itself. In regular TCG, there's so many hand traps you can't really perform your turn 1 combo. Thanks to Monarchic Perfection, being each of the OG Monarchs in one, you have good ways to beat Droll and Lockbird, and all various board breakers people play. And thanks to how I built my deck, I don't lose to Droll at all. Let's jump into it. Starting with the main deck, I have 2 copies of Ether, the Heavenly Monarch. Depending on how we start, Ether is usually the card we keep in our hand when we pass turn to our opponent, being a quick effect tribute summon in the opponent's turn. Pairing it with cards like the Monarch Storm 4th can be absolutely devastating. Additionally, since you'll get a bunch of effects going off when you do so, you can ensure that even if you didn't get enough follow-up on the first turn, you will still get good follow-up thanks to Ether and the resources she provides. But I'm only playing 2 copies of this because it's highly searchable and recyclable. But I do want to have more than one because it is actually pretty good to draw. And in some hands, you have to tribute summon Ether as your first Monarch. And then you may want to use Ether to summon another Ether, so she bounces back to your hand in the end phase. Thus, you still have the hand trap effect of Ether in the following turn. Similarly, I only play 2 copies of Erebus, the Underworld Monarch. Erebus is usually the Monarch we want to summon on our first turn of the game, and also when we go second into a board. With his effect, we can hand rip our opponent. He does not have a hand trap effect like Ether. Instead, he has a graveyard effect, which is quite fitting considering he is the Underworld Monarch, and Ether is the Heavenly Monarch. What Erebus does in the graveyard is you can pitch a Monarch spell or trap, and then you can add any Monarch from your graveyard to your hand. And again, similar to Ether, I'm playing 2 copies because I actually do think the second one comes up in the grind. And even though he can add himself back from the graveyard, if he were to get banished or something, it's nice to have the second one in the deck. And also, you need to have some amount of Monarchs to actually draw them as well. This deck mainly focuses on 2 card combinations. As such, you want to have enough Tribute Fodder and Tributes to actually facilitate your plays. And then to go along with that, I play 3 copies of Eidos, the Underworld Monarch, from Duelist's Advance. This card is absolutely phenomenal. Every time you tribute summon, he just comes back from the graveyard for free. And then he adds a Monarch spell or trap or a Monarch monster from your deck or graveyard to the hand. There's some neat plays with this. When you get drolled, if you're able to either Ether summon this from the deck or tribute summon for Erebus and then summon this from grave, you pay the cost of the big Monarchs, dumping your spell and traps into the graveyard. And then you can add it back with Eidos, which effectively searches from the deck but bypassing the lock from Droll and Lockbird, which is a neat way to access your Monarchic Perfection, even when you can't search it from the deck to the hand. And then for the last Monarch in the main deck, I have 1 copy of Caius, the Shadow Monarch. You may think Caius is extremely dated at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh! And you would be correct, unfortunately. However, there is a card that actually can add as Caius specifically from the deck to the hand, and then tribute summon him in the opponent's turn. And whilst that play doesn't really win you the game, nor is it expected to, it's just a very nice way to end on some amount of interruption. Even when you get drolled, you can ensure that you can play in the opponent's turn, and then when you tribute summon for Caius, you can trigger Eidos and then bring him back and get a search. And then since I'm playing with an extra deck, I can overlay these 2 on the following turn. So even though their hand trap stunted me in my first turn, I was able to play on the following turn, move the game further ahead. Even though I couldn't search on the first turn of the game, I can still search on the second turn of the game. And the Monarch deck is actually very good at surviving, and also pushing through what the opponent has on the following turn. As such, I don't see draw as an automatic lose con, and I even have some cards in my points to help me combat it. Moving on, I have 3 copies of Tessera, the Primal Squire. Squires are the tribute fodder for your Monarchs, and Tessera has so many good effects. She's just an automatic free off in this deck. And whenever she goes to the graveyard, we can summon Idea from the deck. Idea can then summon Eidos from the deck, which grants us an additional tribute summon for the turn. Also, when Idea goes to the grave, we can add back a banished Monarch spell or trap, and then Eidos has a neat effect of banishing him on the following turn, to revive a Squire from the graveyard. I think this ratio is perfect. The second Idea does come up at times, and Tessera can only summon from the deck, so should you draw the one Idea, it would be a brick. Alternatively, forcing you to normal summon the Idea and potentially eating a hand trap on it and then just passing turn outright. A lot of the time in this deck, you actually go through Tessera's effect, summon Idea from the deck, and even if they hand trap you at that point or negate the Idea somehow, you haven't used your regular normal summon, so you can just normal summon over the Idea and then play on from there. However, if they don't interrupt you, thanks to Eidos, you can then get your second tribute summon off. Or perhaps even the third, had you used Tessera's effect, granting you an additional normal summon when she's on the field, which does stack with Eidos, giving you potentially 3 summons in one turn. Then for the Monarch spells, I have 3 copies of Pantheism. This is their version of Destiny Draw, pitching a Monarch spell or trap and drawing 2 cards. And then you can also banish this card from the graveyard. Reveal 3 Monarch spell and traps, and then your opponent picks one for you. If you played back in 2016, you definitely ran into some situations where they had to mind game your opponent. Perhaps you'd already gone through 1 copy of your Monarch Stormforth. Thus, you had 2 left in the deck. However, if you reveal 2 Stormforth, and let's say 1 more copy of Pantheism, your opponent will likely just give you the Pantheism, as clearly you want to add Stormforth with this reveal. If you instead reveal 2 Pantheism and 1 Stormforth to your opponent, keeping 1 in the deck, they might think that, oh, well, he banished the 3rd Pantheism, so he really wants the Pantheism. Then I'm just gonna give him the Stormforth, which he maybe already has 1 in hand. Now, this is mostly a thing that comes up in grind games. If you're in a position where you go first action Pantheism to draw and then banish it, you can probably reveal 3 of the same one to your opponent, thus not giving him a choice and just forcing him to add a Stormforth to your hand. But that mind game is something to think about. But yeah, Pantheism is an obvious 3 of, one of the best Monarch spells ever printed. Then I have the 3 copies of the aforementioned Monarch Stormforth. I did consider playing less of this. Stormforth is not as vital as it was back in 2016, when you had to deal with something like a Cosmo Dark Destroyer, and the main way to clear monsters was to use Ether and Stormforth in the opponent's turn, or Stormforth Erebus, a well-known term from back in the day. However, with this modern version of Monarchs, you do play it a bit differently. And with how new card philosophy is, you rarely have everything on the board that you need to deal with. A lot of the time interruptions are layered, as there may be spells and traps, cards in the hand, cards in the graveyard. But I still very much value the option of having Stormforth as a 3 of in my deck, so I have the option of adding it whenever I really want it from Pantheism. Additionally, drawing Monarch spells and traps is actually pretty good. A lot of the time you end up pitching them for Erebus because he's just chilling in your graveyard and you want to add him back. Or you just pitch them with Pantheism to draw 2 cards. Or with Revolt, which also requires you to pitch a card. As such, there's many ways for you to utilize dead cards in your hand, so even though you draw Stormforth and it may not be the best card at the moment, either in the opponent's turn with Ether, or perhaps some place down the line when you intend to tribute summon a monster, or just pitching it for either of your effects, and then you have a Monarch spell in the graveyard, which is also a valuable resource for this deck, led me to still play 3 Monarch Stormforth. And playing 3 offs of these Monarch spells and traps is a common theme in this deck. Then I have 3 copies of Tenacity of the Monarchs. By revealing a Monarch in the hand, you can add any Monarch spell and trap from your deck. A bit weak to draw, but a very powerful tool in order to grab any of your Monarch spells and traps, even after you've gone through some of them, if you can reveal 3 copies of Tenacity, or perhaps 1 or 2 of the cards you actually want to search. And then the 3rd copy as Tenacity, as long as you have a Monarch to reveal, is basically the same as revealing 3 of the cards you wanted to add. Then the new spell, which is the best card in the deck by far, the Monarch's Revolt. Usually being the card you want to activate first. Even if they draw you, you do get a lot of advantage from resolving this card. And usually what I reveal, depending on my discard of course, tends to be 2 copies of Tessera, and the Monarch I wish to add, usually being Eidos, as long as I have any tribute summon in my hand. Let's say you reveal this to your opponent. If they add Eidos to your hand, perfect, then you can just summon it, because with Tessera, you get Idea into Eidos, which gives you the bodies to tribute summon. If they give you Tessera, you still have 1 that goes to the graveyard, thus you can still summon Idea from your deck. Or if you already have Eidos, you can reveal Erebus, to ensure that you have a strong Monarch to summon in your turn. But of course, what you reveal heavily depends on your hand. And for example, if you activate Revolt and you pitch Tessera, which is the 2-card FTK in this deck, then it doesn't really matter what you reveal. Then for some non-free offs, I have 2 copies of the Monarch's Master Plan. Not quite as good as Spiral Master Plan, but still a pretty good card in this deck. This is the card that searches Kaias the Shadow Monarch from your deck to the hand. And a way to trigger this is that even if you get drawled, if you have this card in hand, you can activate it, dump a Prime. Alternatively, dump these 2 with your big Monarchs. You can use Prime to summon by banishing the Master Plan. Trigger Master Plan and target the opponent's Dark Monster. To search and then tribute summon Kaias the Shadow Monarch. And if you at this point had a Stormforth, you could obviously just use the Stormforth as well, sacking your opponent's monster to summon the Kaias and then banishing a card on their field. But that's not the main interaction of this card. When you activate it, you dump a Monarch spell and trap. And why I wanted that in my deck is so that I can dump Pantheism and get a search. This deck is not super consistent. It doesn't have 1-card combos which leads you into the entire end field you want to get to. A lot of the time you use multiple cards in your hand to facilitate your plays, which is very fun. The deck doesn't feel like you're playing the same game every single game. A lot of the time you end up sequencing your plays differently depending on the cards in your hand, and of course when or if your opponent interacts with you. So Monarch's Master Plan usually is just a concession for that consistency. By being a, albeit quite weak starter, it at least allows me to get into those plays from the get-go. And having the Pantheism be banished before you tribute away your idea, allowing you to recycle it to your hand, is actually very important, which the Monarch's Master Plan allows you to do. Then the last Monarch spell is one copy of Strike of the Monarchs. If I already have all that I need, Strike of the Monarchs is a perfect card to add on top. When you go first, you can beat cards like Evenly Matched, by just negating it and drawing a card. When you go second, you can beat targeting interruptions, such as Effect Veiler, or a Forbidden Droplet for example. I am now playing Domain of the True Monarchs, and that is because I just don't think it's worthwhile. To start, it costs 50 points, and if you play that card in your deck, it's very difficult to fit those other non-engine that I want to have. So basically, you're just making your deck worse when you go second, and worse into Droll and Lockbird, by adding the Domain into your deck. But you make your going first perhaps slightly stronger. However, I think that if you can get through all of your searches, hand rip your opponent once with Erebus, play for follow-up, pass on something like a Strike and a Perfection, that is more than enough interruptions to actually stop your opponent, and ensure that you can play on the following turn. We'll talk more about that when we get to the non-engine. And then I have the Monarch Traps, one copy of Prime and one copy of Perfection. These are both essential, the Prime for your grind game, usually being in the graveyard, and the Perfection being your end piece when you go first. Usually a card I take out when I go second. But that's it for the Monarch spells and traps. For the non-engine, I have 3 copies of Psy-Frame Gear Gamma. Gamma currently costs 15 points, which is very reasonable for a card that's incredibly good in this deck. When you go first and activate either of your search effects, your opponent will immediately draw you on resolution. And if you have a Psy-Frame Gear Gamma in your hand, you can just negate that and go for a late synchro. Or just have 2 tribute bodies in the driver and the Gamma. And at that point, you probably just automatically win. You negated their draw, you got your search through, and you got to make a 10-star synchro in Shengjing, or just have 2 tribute bodies for your plays. And also when you go second, you can Gamma your opponent as a good hand trap. Just negating and destroying a monster is very strong. And for just 45 points, it's quite a deal. Then I have 2 copies of Called by the Grave. Called by costs 20 points each, so I can't play 3 copies of Called by and 3 copies of Gamma, as that would be 105 points. Nor did I want to play 3 Called by and 2 copies of Gamma, because Gamma requires me to play the brick in driver. Also, Gamma is usually way better when you go second, it's actually a real hand trap. In total, discarding Gamma gives me 5 outs to their draw. Coupling that with some hands, just naturally being able to beat this card, positions Monarchs in such a way where even if people do main deck free draw and Lockbird in every single deck, which mind you is not the case, I think it's still fine. Because almost every single other non-engine that they have in their deck is going to be pretty weak against you. Something like Ultimate Slayer, which I am playing 3 copies of because it's such a powerful card in this format. 9 out of 10 times does nothing against you. On your first turn of the game, you will never summon from the extra deck. You pretty much only do it on turn 3, as a lot of the cards that you start with, like the Squires or Revolt, will just lock you. But when you play against other decks with Ultimate Slayer, it's a very versatile card and it's a great board breaker. But that is it for the non-engine that I have in the main deck. For the extra deck, I have 1 copy of Valon. It's just a Slayer target. 1 Goblin's Crazy Beast. Pretty good rank 6 to make, to clear spell and traps. 1 Ptolemy M7. Usually you want to use this card to recycle your own Monarchs or Squires. You can also bounce back their monster, but usually dealing with a monster in this deck is not a problem at all. But the fact that M7 can recycle your resources actually does come up. 1 copy of Evolstar Lars, and 1 Rito, the Moral Leader. These are your rank 6 negates. Again, nothing you make on the first turn of the game, but on turn 3 as your first action before you lock yourself. When you have a Caius and an Eidos, you can overlay it into Lars. Norito does require 2 spellcasters, which would be 2 copies of Eidos, which is not unreasonable to have in your field either, but usually end up going for the Lars, because you can get monsters as well. Then for the rank 8s, 1 copy of Dingirsu, and 1 copy of Felgrand. Ether and Erebus are level 8s, so sometimes you can make rank 8s, and these 2 both cost 0 points, and is an effective way to deal with fields, by non-targeting sending something away, or having an interruption in Felgrand. Then I have 1 copy of Aggregator, just a Slayer target for Exceeds, which the Malong and Packbit also are. 1 Excel Synchro Stardust Dragon and 1 copy of Stardust Dragon. You can make Packbit with Gamma, But usually making Excel, bringing back the Gamma, synchroning them away into Shenging is usually the better play. And it has come up in testing where I used Axel Synchro Stardust's effect to bring back a Gamma. And if my opponent used their interruption at that point, I would have actually liked to use the effect to summon Stardust here, making my Synchro 10 immune. And if they were to do anything to my Gamma or Axel Synchro Stardust Dragon at this point, I would be able to dodge it by just quick synchroing away. And the extra deck is not particularly tight, so it's not an issue at all to fit this card in. And then the last two cards is one copy of Skull Knight and one Garura, which are just the best fusions costing you 0 points for Ultimate Slayer. But that's it for the extra deck. For the side deck, I have 3 copies of Droll and Lockbird. These are 5 points each, so that rounds up the entire deck to 100 points. I consider main decking this card over Ultimate Slayer, which is certainly something you could do. However, with people talking about Droll and Lockbird being such a free and good card in this format, I notice that most people gravitate towards decks that don't lose to Droll and Lockbird at all. As such, I think Slayer is just a more versatile card in game 1, and arguably a stronger card as well, seeing as it usually trades 2 for 1, or at least 1.5 to 1, whilst Droll can be quite hit and miss. 3 copies of Vados, the Eruption Dragon of Extinction. You'd have to excuse the proxy, I've yet to receive mine in the mail, but the reason why I'm citing this card is because it's really good against Vanquish Soul, Archmage and Odeon, and really most field spell decks, which rely on their field spell to get them going. Additionally, the Vados actually does come up sometimes when you go first. It is quite rare, but in some hands you just need to tribute summon a monster to get your plays going. By tributing away the idea, you can add back a banished Pantheism to your hand, and then use that to actually draw into a real monarch, but this card is mainly for the hand trap effects. Then I have 3 copies of Dark Ruler No More, 3 copies of Cosmic Cyclone, and 3 copies of Magic Deflector, which are all just good staples in Genesys Format. That's it for my Monarch deck profile. Have you guys tested Monarchs in Genesys Format? If so, what do you think about it? And let me know what you think about Monarchic Perfection, as opposed to Domain of the True Monarchs, as I believe it is the way to play Monarchs in Genesys Format. But until we see each other again, thank you for watching, and have a good rest of your day. If you enjoy my content, make sure to also subscribe to my second channel, linked in the description box down below. There I'll be posting more personalized and exclusive content.